Hey there, fellow creators. Ben here from Cinderblock Studios, and I am back today with a narrated time lapse. And this one is a kind of a long one, so I do apologize for that in advance. With most of my painting videos, I normally go for a PPV painting process video because I can cut stuff up a little bit more. But I figured, hey, this would be fun to just do an old-fashioned time lapse for a change. And then very quickly, I realized that was a huge mistake because this painting took forever to finish. And I realized about 6 hours into the piece, I'm like, this is going to be a long time lapse. So I figured at some point, I was like, you know what, let's just narrate it, talk about my techniques as I go, and everything like that. So the initial phases you already saw. Initial sketch phase, I was working right on top of a toned canvas that I did. I actually did a slight oil buff to get that tone, let that dry, and then started working on top of that. Fairly basic techniques thus far. If you've seen any of my videos before, simple gradients and acrylics, as well as working in some base color. Sketches, as always, at least in terms of recent years, are being done with paint marker, usually white, black, or gray. So I was played with the idea of doing sort of a big forest piece. I haven't done a big foresty piece in a long time, and I wanted to do some large trees, but also a lot of roots and waterfalls and stone structures throughout it. So for this particular piece, I was like, well, let's start with just doing so the back of it with my original concept design was doing some bigger trees. I put most of those into my liking, and then tossed a little bit of mist on the bottom of them, just to kind of push them back towards the horizon line a little bit more. So what you're going to see a lot of this is a lot of going over the same stuff over and over again once I establish a lot of my base tones. I'm coming in here with some paint marker, just reestablishing where I want some foreground shapes, just making sure that those lines show through as I'm working. I also just saw I had a little bit of a contrast shift there. Must have forgotten to turn on some extra lighting compensation or something like that. You're probably gonna see my pants change several times for this. I was painting in PJs at this point in time, just working in. I was dropping in some stones. I wanted to kind of get my stonework done, or at least placed first. I wanted the roots in some areas to go over top of them, where and then other sections on top of that. So I wanted to kind of place at least the base of the highlights and shadows in for the rocks before I started any of the green stuff, or really any of the brown stuff for the more of the detailed trees. Uh, so I kind of got a base idea for there where I wanted them. I didn't detail anything until pretty close to the end. Um, at this point, I started really establishing more of the browns, and I starting from the back working forward. So I have essentially technically four big layers. Um, for the trees. So I was like, okay, let's establish a baseline, figure out where my roots are kind of going to be, which I did a little bit in the initial paint layer, but I kind of really want to come in and start darkening some of those areas, especially towards the back. Um, and I really had to think about layering and where I wanted things like that and make sure the path drops in before I forget about that, because I will forget about that a lot. I'm like, oh crap, I should have done that and that layer in this order in order to make sure it sort of looked right. Uh, Also, this painting spanned over the course of about 2 months in terms of having time to work on it, because I worked on it in December, but I had a lot going on in December with the holidays. And then January, I was just busy in January, so I didn't have a lot of time to work on it either. So here I'm dropping in some extra little highlights here, figuring out where the other roots are going to be, and then starting to drop in some of the greens as well for some of the grass. Again, I wanted to establish where things were, but not totally detail everything yet. So I'm mostly looking at tonal values and getting at least each individual part of the piece, maybe about 80% there, 85% there, and then coming back in with that later. But again, you'll see me go over that several times, just over and over and over again. Um, so yeah, I was going to say some shadows I'm tossing in there. Again, just establishing those tonal values. And then this was, I think, close to the end of a certain session, putting down the extra black for that foreground element. After that point, I moved to sort of the center, sort of the main focus area, and that was kind of tossing in some green, figuring out where I want the underlying greens to sit, and kind of that center area kind of leans in towards the foreground as well. So I was trying to establish that for myself as well, and a lot of this again, it's all preliminary stuff. Getting to that final detail phase is what I wanted to do from the very beginning, but unless you actually really build that up underneath and build up your underlying layers, you don't really get to have that fun later. So again, similar to what it was before, you're actually going to see me go over the grass on the upper two layers more than once because I forgot what color combination I was using for the backdrop versus the foreground. So you'll see me actually go over the grass and rework some of the stuff in the background a little bit more as well. So then it basically became just the same thing the way that first layer was. It was like grass and tree work, grass. Some path work, and it's just doing that over and over and over again. This was a fun piece to start, but again, it ended up being a little more of a pain. I think I was streaming at this point in time. I see myself with my headset on, so you might see me painting a little bit less. Again, this was really fun to do, but also really time-consuming and kind of a pain sometimes. I must be narrating right here or something for that live show. I brought in a little extra light for the rocks here as well. Again, still not really focusing on details a ton. I'm just trying to establish light and where my light's coming from. And that's really important, especially as I go, considering that a lot of times I forget about that stuff, and I've actually had to repaint entire sections of pieces because I forgot what direction my light source was coming from. This one, the light's coming sort of from the left and from the back a little bit. There's sort of almost like an overcast sky kind of lighting effect. So I kind of have to light stuff and then just shadow underneath for the most part. There's a little more ambiguous with the light sources. So yeah, just pushing on through, establishing anything that I want to fall underneath, getting some extra light in with the waterfalls and base tone with the waterfalls because I knew when I came in with the white, I wanted that to kind of be a dry brush over, but it has to have some light and some of the reflecting light from the sky in that as well. And you kind of see me come in again here pretty loosely with a larger brush than I would otherwise with some highlights, figuring out where those roots are going to sit, making sure they stand out as well. And then dropping in my white a bit more. I was actually a little too liberal with the amount of white I used, which I did rectify later. I kind of came back in with some yellow, which you'll see in a bit. At that point, I was like, all right, well, I could spend forever working on that middle section, but I do want to get the lefter foreground section taken care of. And I came back in with a black paint marker again, figuring out because I really want to do a lot more roots. Actually, probably a lot more roots than I even did with this piece. So I was like, let's start getting in again, establishing these shapes, getting things to a level of brownness that they should be. And but yeah, that's pretty much that. And then once I got those roots in, getting my browns established, getting my greens established for that layer, and really kind of bringing things back together, figuring out where the roots are going to be, and everything like that. So, like again, just the same stuff over and over and over again, just doing it on different layers and with different proportions and sizes, and just making sure things kind of look right. Okay, so now this is actually where things started kind of getting fun because I kind of come in with my liner brush and really start detailing the hell out of everything. So I did take the liberty of adding a few more roots in a few more areas and fixing some shadows and highlights. You see with the grass there. So it's mixes of blues and then mixes of the browns to kind of get things where I want them to be, and then some lighter browns and stuff in like there, making sure things are actually highlighted properly because that certainly does take a little bit of work to do. And then following in afterward with some grays for the rocks, just giving them a little bit extra of a highlight, making sure things stick out where I want them to, and everything like that. And again, it's going to be the same with like same layering process, just dropping more roots in. Because I had my liner brush, had a little thinner paint. Excuse me. Excuse me. I was able to get a lot more of those finer roots that wiggled out and around from the tree, which is what I wanted to do in the first place. But again, I had to at least establish things a little bit in different ways and make sure things sat where I wanted them to sit, and then I could play with, just stringing roots around different places and making sure the roots actually sit where roots would sit. They're growing both towards the water and towards the light, but well, mostly towards the water. But also they're going to form and warp around like the rocks and the other roots that are around them as well, tossing a little extra detailing, especially with the shadows, into the tree, mostly to just make sure that the tonal values I'm using in the roots match the tree itself, because the last thing you want is two different hues or tonal values between all of them. So by the time I got to here, I was starting to feel a little lazier, so I didn't go crazy getting every little detail for the roots. I was like, let me just quick highlight and shadow, and that's it. At this point, I had already spent a little over a month and a half on the piece. I just wanted it to be over with because it had sat in the studio for a long time. So I'm like, let's just drop in my highlights and just get this thing going here. The last bit of detailing I spent over the course of, I think, about a roughly 2-week period, mostly on the weekends, just trying to get all that done. But that, keeping, the paint flowy with all the base establishing layers that I did, I was able to do that in such a way that it's less noticeable in the final piece, just because it's easier to grab the paint and work with it. Because I established all the base layers, all the hard work was done. I could really just highlight that and just go and go and go. So this is the point where I was talking about earlier about going in and sort of re-grassing everything, because I kind of by accident rediscovered what mix I was using for the greens in the background. So I'm like, all right, well, let me go back over this and fix all this stuff so I actually know what I'm doing again. That's not usually a problem for me because I tend to keep my palettes, at least the dried palettes, in between sessions. But again, because this painting spanned across 2 months, I ended up forgetting which mixes I was using, and that can be kind of hazardous even for a beginner, for a pro, for anybody really. This process actually was a little bit longer, doing this sort of cliffside in the path, because I had to again reestablish where I wanted lights and shadows, which I seem to have kind of glazed over. No pun intended in the first place. And so again, I was coming in, making sure the path was the right color. And then once you kind of see me reestablish this base color, I'm like again coming with a liner brush and just detail the hell out of it, which is really where all of the finer finesse comes in. I also had a little path cutting off to the left there as well, which is something I really loved. That was really kind of just improvised last minute. I'm like, what, this would look good if it actually just kind of branched out with maybe a little step coming down. So at this point, it's liner brush for some thicker, thinner paint, and then a softer dry brush that I can pull that out with. So I was just getting those edges and then pulling that out in the middle, making sure that I didn't go overboard with that white. Also, I went over the waterfalls at some point, maybe about 10 minutes ago, or 5 minutes ago in the video, with all of the getting some extra yellow tones in there as well. All right, so at this point, again, moving on to sort of that last major upper section there, working with the greens, reestablishing light tones and dark tones there, making sure again, the grass matches like with the 3 big layers, because that was really, really important, and something that ended up being, let's say, harder than it should have been. And because you always see me lift up the canvas, paint the sides, because it's just something I'm going to do anyway. I decided to take a few more, sort of, I guess, extra liberties with the section on the left there, just because it ended up being easier for me to figure out that way. I just needed a little more paint, a little more extra, a little more finessing to get that right where I wanted it to be. Not to mention getting my angles correct. Um, I decided to borrow some my own advice with my old stone blocks tutorial. So I wanted to have at least the closer section of that cliff be a little more defined. So I dropped in some grout lines for the rocks, and then came in, of course, on top of that, re-highlighting and shadowing all of those. Although actually my lines were slightly off; they should have been more curved in order to get the perspective correct. That's actually a fairly major oversight that I totally regret with this piece because those angles are completely wrong for that perspective, at least for that perspective anyway. Um, but you only know this by watching. Probably the person who ends up buying the piece in the end will not really care, so I'm not super concerned about that. And again, because I established all those base tones, all I'm really doing here is just coming in mostly with the corner of that small flat brush and some white to get those highlighty tones in that. Now I knew from the beginning that I didn't want that tree on the right to be super bright. I wanted to keep that a lot of darker tones in that, and I did end up keeping that, at least for the most part, towards the end of the piece. Really, the whole concept behind that is just because I want the light to really be showing through in the background more than the mid in the background than the foreground. The foreground is going to be way more in shadow, so I just kind of kept my tonal areas a lot more there, highlighted very minimally, just enough to keep those layers separate, especially down towards the roots to kind of show the roots a little bit more than anything else. I also wasn't super thrilled with the final shape of where the lower roots meet the upper part of the tree. I think it looks a little wonky, but hey, you live and you learn, and you hopefully fix it before you start painting. So some final touch-ups with grass there, getting a little extra texture in, and things like that. This particular clip's a little slower as I'm dropping in the figure. There's actually several figures in this piece, not just one or two as usual. I wanted to make the world feel like it is a little bit more life sprawling throughout the course of the piece. In the piece itself, of course, Wellspring of Eternity, I believe is the title of it, wanted to give the idea that more people have traveled through the area. So in addition to the two figures on the right side of the piece, I also had added another one on the left, just to give, again, the indication that the paths are more traveled than just like the one person finding this place in the middle of nowhere. So that's roughly about it. I don't know if I got it on camera or not, but I did add a little bit of extra light coming in from the left, some sunbeams pulling in. But at this point, it was just tossing in my signature and yeah, calling it a piece. And at that point, I actually ended up signing this with 2 years, 2019 and 2020, because it did bridge that gap between December and January. So I gave it both years and actually without a month. In order to at least show that given the time and frame that it took to make it and the what time I spent on it, and that's where I kind of ended up with it. But yeah, I didn't capture that. It's very subtle. At the end of the day, what I did with the extra lighting there, it's almost impossible to see on the final piece, but it does add a little bit of extra something to the piece in person. So yeah, that was this piece, Wellspring of Eternity. Probably should have been a PPV, painting process video, but it just ended up being that I started doing it as a time lapse, so I decided to stick with it. And being that a time lapse and being as long and complicated of a painting that this was, ended up just being that I needed to narrate this one rather than just tossing music in the background, because I feel like talking about all these little things as we go are kind of interesting. So if you enjoyed this, you want to check out more work, anything like that, be sure to subscribe here to the Cinderblock Studios channel. Check me out on social media, and this has been from Cinderblock Studios reminding you to sketch every day. Or to... yeah. Okay, not sketch every day. Keep on creating. God. Sketch Every Day is the other channel, Ben. Cripes. Wow. You even got an outtake in this one.